Joining me today for the interview is Dr. Cathy Vatterott. Cathy is Professor Emeritus of Education at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. Previous to that, she was both a teacher and a principal. She is the author of 4 books, including the most recent publication, Rethinking Homework, second edition, which came out in 2018, and also 2015's Rethinking Grading, Meaningful Assessment for Standards-Based Learning. Cathy is best known as an international expert on the topic of K-12 homework and on standards-based grading. And over the last several years, her work with high-achieving secondary schools has been the catalyst for her latest research, which has been about writing and researching teen stress. So we're going to focus on both of those topics today. Cathy, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Great. Thanks, Tom, for having me. It's great to see you again. Been a few years, but I'm following everything you're doing, and it's all been great. So.
Fantastic. Thanks. Yes, it's wonderful to have you here as well. And as I was mentioning to you before, it's great to reconnect. And one of the wonderful parts about doing this podcast is, of course, having guests like yourself on the podcast, but it is also a great opportunity to reconnect with friends and colleagues from the past that I have lost touch with. And so this is a great chance for us to reconnect and a great chance for us to have a conversation. So let's jump right in. You, of course, are known as the homework lady for all the right reasons. Your expertise is obvious. Rethinking Homework was originally published in 2009, and it made an immediate and significant contribution to the never-ending discourse on homework. So much so that a second edition, as I mentioned earlier, was published in 2018. So let's start with the best and the worst of what homework has to offer students. At its best, homework is what? And at its worst, homework is what?
At its best, homework would be a way for students to get excited about learning, for them to explore topics in more depth, and yes, for them to get practice or for them to apply their learning. At its worst, it is, first of all, a thief of downtime, family time, and sleep. At its worst, it could be a mindless task that just kills the curiosity and the love of learning. And I think most importantly, at its worst, it exacerbates inequities. And in more than one way, when we talk about inequity, we think about economic inequity, the homework gap, which, by the way, has been around for years, but it didn't really get enough press until we had a global pandemic for them to realize that, oh, there's a gap here economically. But just as importantly, it exacerbates inequities between struggling learners and learners who are not struggling. So you send a task home and the struggling learner says, oh my God, I'm so stupid, I can't do this. And then you have other students that learn rather quickly that are saying, why do I need to do this? So I think those are probably the biggest concerns I have about homework at its worst.
Yeah, this is a constant conversation amongst educators. I mean, homework conversations were around and debates around homework were around when I was starting teaching in the early 1990s, and they seem to continue. You mentioned the pandemic, and of course, we are still in the midst of the pandemic. I'm wondering from your perspective, you clearly hear from a lot of people, how have the conversations changed? We know that because of COVID and because of the situation that all educators found themselves in, that some of the conversations that had been long overdue were accelerated because of what happened acutely in the spring of 2020 and the onset of COVID. So what are some of the interesting maybe conversations you've heard or been a part of, and that collective rethink about homework due to the pandemic and due to what's happened during COVID?
Well, I think it's been real interesting to see which tasks got done. So when we looked at which tasks were meaningful to kids, that actually got accomplished, and which tasks allowed for choice. But I think the other thing that we were seeing is that, boy, this is about engagement. You don't have, if you don't have ownership of these tasks, you don't have engagement. But also the grading issue came up like in a really big fashion. Yeah. As we looked at, well, gee, how do I grade them for not logging in? How do I grade them for not completing a task? And so I think those are the conversations that really got to be important. And as well as parents don't want this job That became very clear that parents don't want to be the homework cop. And I think that was very important too.
Yeah, it's amazing how so many of those topics really blend together. Hearing about teachers, I'd hear questions about, Tom, what do we do about academic dishonesty? And that speaks to the quality of what students were being asked to do at home, which ties right in with the homework issue, as you talked about the best and worst scenario.
Right.
And that's why sometimes for me, I know I get a little frustrated when homework is sort of talked about as a kind of singular exercise, as opposed to asking the question, what is the quality of what students are doing? And does that bring value? So one of my favorite things that you say, Cathy, and I love this quote, I use it all the time in the workshops, is because I think you can, if you have a particular position on homework, you will be able to find an expert or an authority who will support your position. If you're anti-homework and homework is of the devil, you'll find someone who'll support you in that.
Yeah.
If you're not, you'll find the opposite. I love this quote. You say, quote, "The value of the research is in the broad strokes it paints, not in the minutia. That its value comes from as we reflect on the logic of its conclusions. Do they make sense for our population of students?" So like I said, there's no shortage of opinions about homework, and most of them are not on the fence. Most of them are quite definitive and absolute. You can almost find the research you're looking for. So help us with those broad strokes here in 2021. What does the research on homework tell us? And maybe more importantly, what does the research not tell us?
Right. So in order to talk about the research, we need to understand that the research is deeply flawed, and that most of the research over the past 40 years has been comparing time spent on homework to achievement and trying to correlate those two things. So I guess one of the benefits of that research on time is that it did show us that there is a limit to time, to how much time is effective. And so it reinforced a longstanding 10-minute rule that the maximum amount of homework for a child should be 10 minutes per grade level per night. And that seems to be consistent with that research on time. That said, time is not the metric. What we need to be looking at is task, is what is the quality of the task, as you said. Now, another piece that's been used over and over again is that, well, there's no correlation between homework and achievement at the elementary level. So this has given cover to elementary schools who wanted to get rid of homework. That said, does that make sense? Does it make sense that a child who practices math would get better at math? Doesn't it make sense that a child who read more would get to be a better reader? And so that's the part we have to look at. What we found out in different research was that reading for pleasure correlates with increased standardized test scores at all levels. And so if we were going to do anything at elementary, why wouldn't we just do the reading? So those I think are the biggest issues. And the fact that John Hattie, one of my favorite researchers here, when he looked at the correlation between a practice and achievement, homework ranked 88th, yet formative evaluation ranked 3rd, and feedback ranked 10th. So what does that say about how much we're doing with homework that is ineffective? So I always say it's not that homework doesn't work, it's that there's a lot of bad homework out there.
Right. Yeah. Low quality assignments that, packets and things like that. And I think, as you talk there, it makes me think about, is one of the challenges and maybe problems with the way we talk about homework is that we have such a narrow view of what constitutes homework. We often think of homework as, something that the teacher assigns, or we think about those stapled packets that students have to fill in at the elementary level, instead of trying to realize that homework can be very expansive. And I've heard yourself and I've heard others like Harris Cooper and others talk about taking a more expansive view. So can you talk a little bit more about, what could we include as part of quote unquote homework that maybe teachers aren't thinking of right now?
Well, I think the first part is that we need to be creative, and but also that we need to quit looking at it, limiting it to practice. I think that is a mistake. I think we should be using it more for diagnostic, more to check for understanding, and more for application. So for instance, why do we give a traditional task like practicing math when we should be asking kids to go home and apply that math to things in the pantry or to cooking? Why do we not let students have choices about what they should be doing in order to learn something? And my early on example, when my son was in fifth grade, I guess it was, or fourth grade, whatever grade, and they sent him home to memorize his multiplication tables. And they said, everybody needs to write them 3 times. And I'm like, well, that's not how he learns them. So he wanted to make a rap song. And I said, why could we not allow students, give them the goal and allow them to figure out what task will get them to that goal, and then have them practice their method, give them a no count quiz, and then let them say, oh, this method didn't work as well for me. So I think we're missing the boat by designing the task when kids could be designing their own tasks.
Yeah, I think we are. I think the upside or the optimism of what you're talking about there is that I think never before in my career have I seen more teachers open to more a student-centered approach to education, never mind homework. At the same time, I think you and I recognize that while we have more openness to that idea, there is still a long way to go to creating that real authentic agency and choice for students in how they sort of apply or practice assignments. And I think one thing that everyone agrees is that sitting at the kitchen table for 3 hours struggling through something is counterproductive to any sort of learning, and counterproductive to my disposition, because in the end, we really want students to have high rates of success with that which they are working on at home, whether it be practice or application. So that leads me to the next question. Homework, as I just mentioned, could be a major contributor to stress and anxiety levels in our students. And I do want to pivot to stress and anxiety in general in a moment, but I want to stick with homework for this last question, and then we'll pivot to the larger question about stress. We know that some stress in life is unavoidable, but that said, what are some strategies and some approaches to homework that teachers can use to try to minimize the stress levels of their students and make homework a more productive exercise?
I think the first thing that teachers need to do is hold harmless. And what I mean by that is that this cannot hurt a student, which means we either don't grade it or we give them an opportunity to make up the work. We grade it very lightly, but that we actually hold kids harmless for these tasks. Then the second thing, when we look at what we're doing, I just think so many of the things we do don't make sense. It's like, if we know kids have other obligations outside of school, why do we give them a task at 3 p.m. and expect it to be back at 8 the next morning? Why aren't we doing more weekly or monthly long-term assignments for kids? Why aren't we being more flexible in terms of when kids are allowed to turn things in? So I think that is a huge piece. And then you talked about the agency piece. I think kids need to have choices. I think we need to look at, and I think we need to look at how kids have time during the school day for kids who don't necessarily have a good environment at home to work.
Right. That's something for sure that we have to consider is, there is an underlying assumption that assigning something for homework or asking students to apply something at homework, or even if the students are making the decision on their own to extend their learning at home, that there is a supportive environment there. And we have to account for the fact that for many of our students, there is not. Can you maybe just quickly, an example of how, you might have a teacher listening right now saying, okay, I'm in, Cathy, I want my students to have more choice and agency, but I don't really know how to do that. So what is an example of what a teacher could do to bring students inside the conversation to say, okay, students, here's where you have some choices around what is quote unquote for homework?
So I wrote an article a few years ago about a school in Norwell, Massachusetts that was doing what they called student-owned homework.
Okay.
And the teachers would present the goal to the students. Students would brainstorm how they might reach that goal. And then they would get an agreement between the teacher and the student. So for instance, if their job, this was the one that's coming to mind is I believe a first grader that said, oh, well, I need to practice my counting. I counted my brother's trophies at the Taekwondo class. And the students come back and say, yes, this is what I created. So I think there are a lot of ways to do that. But that means kids have to be familiar with the goal. They have to understand the goal, and perhaps they have to look at some examples of those goal options. And that's one of the other things teachers can do. They can provide options to kids. They can provide options like, here's this video you can watch. Here's this assignment that you can look at online, or here's this assignment that you can use. So for the most part, once you give kids that agency, they're pretty creative at coming up with what they need. The problem is teachers are hesitant to give up that control. Mm-hmm. Because they're going, oh my God, what if I do that and then the student doesn't learn? Well, then you do something different. Right. But aren't we supposed to be telling kids that it's okay to make mistakes? Yeah. And so I think that's part of the dilemma with letting kids have some control over things.
Yeah, I suppose at its worst, it's about giving up control and worries about that. At its best and most optimistically, you have teachers who just don't want to lose or be inefficient with their time, and they want to make sure that every opportunity to learn is maximized. And maybe there are places where those types of opportunities are not necessarily supported by administration, or they might be not supported by parents, and there's all sorts of pressures on there. But yes, the point about just being able to let some of that go and being able to know that it's okay, that if it doesn't go perfectly the first time, that I can try a different approach and continue. That's how we learn and grow as professionals, right? I want to shift. Oh yeah,
I have a but.
Okay.
And that is that we have to let go of the idea that our tasks are infallible. Yeah. Like that teacher that said, write those multiplication tables 3 times. I think we have an idea in our head that says, oh, this will get you to the learning that I need, and not necessarily.
Right. Yeah. And I think the larger point that you made earlier is focus on it sounds very flippant when you say focus on the learning, but we really create this idea of focus on the learning, not the task. The task is the means to an end. So the end goal, as you mentioned earlier, what is the learning that needs to occur, and the agency can come through the task. I appreciate that. Right. So I want to shift to the larger picture. I mean, homework is obviously included, but we want to shift to anxiety, stress, and just the pressure of being a young person in today's society. And I wonder what your perspective on this. Do you think adults, teachers, parents, families, do you think adults today minimize what it's like to be a teenager compared to when we were young? Is it harder to be a teen in today's world? And if so, like why is it harder to be a teen? And why isn't that sort of flippant comment like, well, I had to go through it when I was young. It's good for them too. What's different, and why is it more stressful to be a young person in today's society?
Well, first of all, I think as teenagers, there is a lot of whining. So I think it's easy for parents to say, oh, stop it. It's fair not bad. I think there's a lot said there. But yeah. I think there's a lot of things that are different today. But I think one of the biggest issues is this hyperconnectivity that with technology, that they are 24/7. They have this connectedness. And so here they're trying to figure out their identity, but guess what? They have 2 identities. They have their real identity, and then they have their virtual identity. Yeah. And so I think that makes things so much more complicated. Now, with our students, to me, our middle class and upper class students, I think have an additional issue. And that is, that there is this sort of mass hysteria out there right now of this this academic climate that says that if you don't get to Harvard, you're going to be homeless. That there's only one path to success, and it's this, and what that's led to, this general concept has led to this parental pressure, this relentless parental expectations that you have to get the grades, you have to get into the right college. And I think what that does to kids is it gives them this idea that the only thing that matters is the future and the present is not important. Mm-hmm. And I think that doesn't fit with what they know is going on. They know they're going through puberty. Yeah, let's see if parents can remember puberty, for goodness sake. Physical, intellectual, emotional, social changes that are happening during this time period for kids. So I think those are probably the biggest things that make it harder for kids right now.
Yeah, that connectivity. I know something like Instagram can be the best and the worst of what society has to offer, and all the filters and all the things that go on. It's an interesting dichotomy as well, because one of the questions I ask in workshops from time to time is, how many of you would go back to junior high? This is asking teachers. How many of you would go back to junior high? And almost no hands ever go up, unless I suppose unless you peaked in junior high, no one would go back, right? So It's interesting because my follow up to that is often, then why do you keep telling students that and children or teenagers, why do you keep telling them that this is the best time of their lives?
Yeah.
Why do you keep telling them that this is the greatest time in their lives, and yet none of us would go back to that environment? And now, as you say, that dual sort of personality, or that, my online persona and who I am in real life, they start to blend, and pretty soon you start to see that anxiety and that stress and that pressure just continuing to emerge 24/7, because someone's always got it better. And I think adults suffer from that as well in this age of social media. Look, schools don't have control over everything that contributes to students' anxiety and stress. It's not all on the school. However, schools do have control over a lot that does contribute to student stress and anxiety. So what are some school-based sources of that intense stress and anxiety that students feel? And what can schools do to mitigate or minimize the impact of those sources and the influence it has on student stress and anxiety?
So Challenge Success, a group coming out of Stanford, did a study with NBC News recently, and they were asking kids about stressors. And the number one stressor was grades, tests, and other assessments. And the second one was workload and homework. Mm-hmm. So that gives us the cue right there, what we need to be looking at. So I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but standards-based grading does so much for students. It gives them back control. It helps them focus on what's important, but also look what it does to things like homework and workload. If the goal is to show and demonstrate the learning, then maybe you don't have to do all that homework. Maybe you're only doing what gets you to that goal. When you think about what's stress, I'll tell you what stress is. Stress is one-shot grading. Do I know it Tuesday at 10 o'clock? And if I don't, I'm screwed. Right. Compared to the idea that it is possible to redeem yourself, that to me has the biggest issue.
Yeah.
But also the idea that in secondary schools, do teachers coordinate workload? Do teachers coordinate homework? Do teachers coordinate projects? And final research papers? And do they coordinate them with extracurricular activities when the football game is, when the play is being held, when the concert is being held?
Those are absolutely right. I mean, you talk about workload and you talk about the way we grade and the stresses of grading. I think about workload. You made me think about this continuing pressure around AP, for example. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why schools continue to allow students to take 6 or 7 or even 8 AP classes. A college freshman doesn't take 7 or 8 AP classes. Why are we why is this pressure, and why are we allowing this to, parents, they don't know any better, and they look around and they think, other kids are doing it. I want my kid to achieve at a high level. I don't really blame parents for wanting to have their children aspire to high levels, but what can we do to stop this frenzy that gets created around advanced placement and other sort of programs like it, that schools seem to not pay attention to how it's impacting the students in their school?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic, one of the interesting outcomes, is when they started saying that we're not going to put as much emphasis on the standardized test scores, and we're not going to put as much emphasis on we're going to look more at the essays. We're going to look more at those kind of things. So I think there are some changes afoot there, but I totally agree with you that we need to be educating parents about the stress that these things cause. We also need to be educating teachers about what does AP look like. If it's really college level, then it shouldn't be homework piled higher and deeper. It should be looking at the depth of learning. And I think there's ways for that to be less stressful. One of the things I didn't talk about when we were just talking about stress is, what does a student's day look like when they go to school? And some interesting studies have come out. I think the one that pops into my head was called Unlocking Time. And it said that if you really wanted to help reduce stress for kids, you would give them more like 5 to 7 minutes of passing time instead of 3 minutes. Wow, what a concept. Can we get rid of the bells? Talk about frenzy, and then can we look at they're saying 30 to 45 minutes for lunch, for instance. Do we have a non-academic block of time during the school day where teachers can see students that are having issues? So all of those things are just, why aren't we looking at some of those pieces as well in terms of what that kid's day looks like?
It is, there's no shortage of information out there and ideas out there for how we can reshape what the school day looks like, how we can begin to address some of these issues. Going back to that AP issue, seniors in high school, the amount of time they spend in school compared to a college freshman, you probably attend school 10 to 12 hours fewer in your first year. Therefore, you have the space to take on college level subjects. And yet we still allow kids to take 6 or 7 or 8 AP classes. And the grading piece as well, Cathy, I love that idea that, imagine the novel concept that grades be based only on the quality of evidence that students produce and the reaching of those standards. Let's finish up this part with some advice for teachers and advice for principals and all educators on how they can talk to students, specifically teens, about stress and anxiety. I wonder, is it helpful to be more overt and obvious in talking to students about the sources of stress, and also to have open and honest conversations about how to handle stress? And if you think that's an important idea, and if you don't, set me straight, but if you do, what are some of the key messages or approaches that we might take when trying to address this issue of stress and anxiety in schools?
So yes, I think there is education that is needed to educate kids about stress and I would say about some of the organic factors that exacerbate stress, like the relationship between sleep and mood disorders, like the relationship between nutrition, diet, exercise, the downtime, those sorts of things. But also what we're learning about how we help kids deal with stress is one of the first things that we need. We need to know that every student has a trusted adult that they can go to at school when they need someone to talk to. And I was just reading about a school that sort of deputized everybody in the school to be those trusted adults. So it might be the custodian. It might be the lunch lady. It might be a different person than you would think of as counselors or teachers. Now, that said, I think those one-on-one conversations, I think the most important thing is for us to listen. I was working with a school in which they had a student panel come in and talk about stress, and the teachers all got to listen to this group of kids. And that part was really important. So I think we need to listen And as one psychologist said, just listen. Kids need to spill out all of their ideas and organize them without you adding yours. I thought that was great. And then after that, well, okay, then what are some options? So I think we say, what are some options? And then when the student says, well, I can't ask to take that test on another day, then you say, well, how do you know that? Teachers are more flexible than you think. And then, of course, if the teacher's not flexible, then we come back to another issue. So I think those are the pieces that we really need to look at, is that education of not only how to manage it, but what can you do? Why are you taking 6 AP classes? And, does someone need to talk to your parents about you taking 6 AP classes? And, but yeah, I totally agree with what you said before about why do we let kids do some of the things we let them do?
Mm-hmm. I wonder sometimes if, an observation that I've had, I want your thoughts on this before we finish up. It seems to me we're at this place where, and listeners, you've heard me say this before, is that I think we talk a good game when it comes to student mental health, student stress, student anxiety. We talk a good game when it comes to mental health in the abstract. But then when it comes to actually implementing strategies or putting the brakes on some things or rethinking the way the schools operate, we seem to still be hesitant. There seems to still be that stigma. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how do we fix that? How do we start to close that?
Well, I think we need to address directly some misconceptions that rigor equals load. Mm-hmm. And that is what's important, is that, oh yeah, we're a tough school. We have all of these recommendations for kids. So I think that is part of it. But also I think just taking a more holistic view about our role in that stress. Mm-hmm.
Really good point there with I think sometimes adults forget that we can be great contributors to the stress and anxiety that students feel, and we can also be the source of reducing that stress and anxiety through the way that we interact with them. Because again, what adults pay attention to is what students will start to believe is important, and or children will start to believe is important. Right. And if we start piling on with the stress and all of that, I think I could talk to you about this for another hour or two. So fantastic, Cathy. I really appreciate it. 2 questions left here as we finish up our conversation. And here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction you want to. But educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
That we don't have enough big picture thinking in education, that we tend to see a problem and find a stick-on solution, a program that's going to fix whatever it is that we have a problem with, and not looking, as I kind of said before, about what our role might be in contributing to any specific problem.
Yeah, I can see that, where we're always looking for a solution, but we're not rethinking the entire system itself and having that big picture thinking, for sure. Can you give me an example of an idea or a topic that would be big picture thinking that we're not really having a conversation about right now?
Well, I think you nailed it when you said what we do with kids' mental health or wellness. Is that I get really aggravated at, oh God, I'll make everybody mad now. I get really aggravated at some of we need social emotional learning. Yes, I know there are things that we need to do here for social emotional learning, but when it comes to student stress, the answer is not, well, we need mindfulness and meditation classes, or we need a therapy dog in the school. No, we need to look at why these kids have 7 classes a day, and why we are piling on the homework with no correlation or no coordination between the teachers. And so, and I could go on. And it's not that those programs, it's not that social emotional learning programs are not good or not important. And it's not that teaching kids stress management is not important. The issue is it's a sort of a myopic view of the problem. Is like, oh, here, we need to look at this. This is the problem. And it's like, no, step back, take the 30,000 foot view, and really look more broadly at these individual things that are going on in education. And if we have one gift from the pandemic, it would be that we are starting to look more broadly, I think, at particular problems.
So the real question becomes, why do we need those programs in the first place? Why do we need to have those? Why is that bubbling up to the surface?
Right.
Last question, Cathy, as we finish up. It's a question I ask everyone I've interviewed so far in the podcast. And it's a very simple question about success and happiness. And the question is quite simple. It's, what's your definition of success? What does success mean to you?
Well, first of all, success to me does not mean money or power. The first thing to me, I had three things. I thought about this and I had three things. So I thought first, meaningful work that contributes to something bigger than your own ego. And I think that is what to me is success. And then the second thing is that we balance that with what I would call passionate pastimes. So your passionate pastime might be your job. It might be education, but I think you need another passionate pastime. So whether that be, cooking or gardening or music or classic movies, whatever, I think there needs to be something in your life in which you really get to enjoy and feel passionate about. And then the third piece to me is meaningful personal relationships, that you have relationships with people who care about you and people that you care about. Yeah. And if I can get all three, I think I'm doing pretty good right now. If I can get those three things, to me, that is a successful life.
Yeah. Well, I think I sense a theme there of success being meaningfulness, meaningful work, doing something that is meaningful to me, and developing meaningful relationships. Yeah. I love that. Listeners, you can and should definitely follow Cathy on Twitter. Pay attention here. Her Twitter handle is @RealHomeworkLady, but lady is spelled without an A. So it's LDY at the end, @RealHomeworkLady. You can also check out Cathy's website. This one is homeworklady.com. And in this case, lady does have an A at the end of the website. So Cathy, you've not made this very easy for people to follow you. No problem. But again, @RealHomeworkLady without an A on Twitter, and www.homeworklady.com on the website. Cathy, really, really appreciate you taking the time to be with me. Thanks so much.
Great. Loved it. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.